The last stand on frozen Earth. The ice crunched under Captain Sarah's boots as she made her way across the frozen wasteland that used to be Central Park. New York City lay buried under 3 miles of solid ice, just like every other city on Earth. The great towers that once reached toward the sky were now tomb markers in a planet-wide graveyard. Sarah pulled her thermal coat around her body. Even with the advanced heating systems, the cold still found ways to bite through to her bones. The temperature hadn't risen above -60 degrees in over 2 years, not since the Star Empire had positioned their massive ice-generating satellites around Earth. "Captain, we've got movement on the horizon," came the voice of Lieutenant through her communication device. His breath created small clouds of vapor as he spoke into his radio from the observation post they'd built into the ruins of the old subway station. Sarah lifted her binoculars and scanned the white landscape. In the distance, she could see the familiar purple glow of hoverships moving slowly across the frozen surface. They were probably collecting more human prisoners for their work camps on distant planets. They had arrived 3 years ago with promises of peace and cooperation. They claimed to represent the most advanced civilization in the galaxy, with technology that could solve all of humanity's problems. Their ships were beautiful, sleek vessels that seemed to dance through space rather than fly. But it was all lies. Within months of their arrival, they had revealed their true purpose. They needed workers for their massive construction projects on dead planets throughout their empire. Humans, they discovered, were perfect for this work, strong enough to handle heavy labor, smart enough to follow complex instructions, but not advanced enough to resist their superior technology. The ice satellites had been their master stroke. Rather than fight a long war, they simply froze the planet, making it impossible for humans to grow food or maintain their technological civilization. Most of the population had either died in the first winter or been captured and shipped off-world. Only a few thousand humans remained, scattered in small resistance groups across the frozen planet. Sarah's group consisted of 43 survivors hiding in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath what used to be Manhattan. They had managed to jury-rig heating systems from old subway equipment and scavenged supplies from frozen buildings. But their situation was desperate. "How many ships?" Sarah asked into her radio. "Looks like a full harvesting fleet," replied. "Maybe 12 hoverships and 2 transport vessels. They're heading toward the Brooklyn settlement." Sarah's heart sank. The Brooklyn settlement housed nearly 100 survivors, including many children. If they found them, it would be one of the largest captures since the freezing began. She made her way back down into the tunnel system where her people had set up their base. The main chamber had once been a subway platform, but now it served as their command center, medical bay, and living quarters all in one. Makeshift beds lined the walls, and a small cooking area had been set up near the old ticket booth. The survivors looked up as she entered. Their faces were thin from months of rationed food, and their eyes held the hollow look of people who had lost almost everything. But Sarah could still see the spark of defiance that kept them going. "Listen up, everyone," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the tunnel. "We've got ships moving toward Brooklyn. We all know what that means." A woman named Doctor stepped forward. She had been a physicist at Columbia University before the freezing, and now she served as the group's technical expert. "We can't take on a full harvesting fleet with what we have, Sarah. Our weapons are barely enough to damage a single hovership." She was right, and everyone knew it. The resistance groups had managed to cobble together some weapons from military supplies and industrial equipment, but they were no match for energy shields and plasma cannons. Every direct confrontation with the aliens had ended in disaster for the humans. "I know," Sarah said, "but we can't just let them take those people without a fight. We've been planning the subway tunnel attack for weeks. Maybe it's time to try it." The tunnel attack was a desperate plan they had developed after studying patrol patterns. The idea was to lure a small group of soldiers into the subway system, where their hover technology would be useless, and the confined spaces would neutralize some of their advantages. An older man named Professor James Wright, who had been a military historian before the invasion, shook his head. "It's too risky, Sarah. We've only got one shot at something like this. If we blow it, they will know about our hideout, and we'll all be dead or captured within hours." Sarah looked around at the faces of her people. They were scared, cold, and running out of hope. But she could also see something else in their eyes, a desperate need to feel like they were fighting back instead of just hiding and waiting to die. "The way I see it," Sarah said, "we're already dead. The food supplies won't last another month and the heating system is breaking down. We can either sit here and freeze to death, or we can go down fighting and maybe save some lives in the process." Young Tommy, no relation to Sarah despite the shared name, raised his hand. At 19, he was one of the youngest members of their group and had become something of a technical genius, maintaining their equipment with whatever materials he could scavenge. "What if we could improve our weapons?" he asked. "I've been studying the energy patterns from their ships. Their shields operate on a rotating frequency. If we could time our attacks just right, we might be able to punch through." Doctor looked interested. "How would we synchronize that kind of timing?" Tommy pulled out a small device he had been working on. It looked like a combination of a smartphone and some kind of scanner, held together with wire and tape. "I built this frequency detector from old radio equipment. It can read the shield patterns and predict when they'll be weakest." Sarah felt a small spark of hope. Maybe they weren't completely outmatched after all. "How long would you need to modify our weapons?" "Give me 12 hours, Tommy said. "And I'll need everyone to bring me any electronic components they can find. Old phones, radios, anything with circuits." As the group dispersed to search for materials, Sarah found herself standing alone with Professor Wright. The old man had become something of a father figure to her since her real father had been taken in one of the early raids. "You know this is probably suicide," he said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied, "but what choice do we have? We can't keep running forever." Professor Wright nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud of you, Sarah. He always said the worst thing humans could do was give up hope." As the hours passed, the group worked frantically to prepare for what might be their final battle. Tommy worked his technical magic, somehow managing to create weapon modifications that could potentially penetrate shields. Doctor calculated the best locations for their ambush, using her knowledge of physics to predict how energy weapons would behave in the confined tunnel spaces. Meanwhile, Sarah and a few others made reconnaissance trips to the surface, tracking the movement of the ships and trying to identify which soldiers might be vulnerable to their trap. They themselves were fascinating and terrifying creatures. They stood about 7 feet tall with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in certain lights. Their eyes were large and completely black, giving them an unsettling appearance that made humans instinctively uncomfortable. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested they had evolved in low gravity, and their technology seemed to respond to their thoughts as much as their actions. But Sarah had noticed something during her observations. They were overconfident. They had been conquering primitive planets for so long that they barely bothered with security when dealing with what they considered inferior species. They often sent small patrols into dangerous areas without backup, assuming their superior technology would protect them. It was this overconfidence that Sarah hoped to exploit. As evening approached, the group gathered around their makeshift map of the tunnel system. Sarah had marked the locations where they would place their modified weapons and the routes the patrol would hopefully take. "Remember," she said, "we only get one chance at this. If we miss or if the weapon modifications don't work, we run. No heroic last stands. We retreat and try to stay alive for another day." Everyone nodded, but Sarah could see the determination in their faces. They were tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of watching their species become extinct without a fight. As they prepared to move out, Doctor pulled Sarah aside. "There's something you should know," she said. "I've been monitoring radio transmissions from the other resistance groups. We're not the only ones planning something big. Groups in London, Tokyo, and Moscow are all preparing major operations for tomorrow." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the frozen air. "Coordinated attacks? How is that possible? We haven't been in communication with other groups for months." "I think," Doctor said slowly, "that human beings have reached the same conclusion all over the world. We're running out of time, and if we're going to make a stand, it has to be now." As Sarah led her people through the dark tunnels toward their destiny, she couldn't help but wonder if this was how every species felt in its final moments. Were they about to become another footnote in the Empire's history of conquest, or was this the moment when humanity would prove it deserved to survive? The tunnel ahead was dark and cold, but for the first time in months, Sarah felt something that had almost been forgotten in the frozen wasteland of Earth. She felt hope. "The underground war begins. The ambush location was perfect. Sarah and her team had chosen a section of the old subway tunnel where the ceiling had partially collapsed, creating natural choke points and hiding spots. The debris from the fallen concrete provided cover, while the narrow passages would force them to move in single file. Tommy had finished installing the modified weapons just as the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the cracks in the tunnel ceiling. The weapons looked crude compared to technology, basically human assault rifles with strange electronic components strapped to them with wire and tape. But Tommy insisted they would work. "The key is timing," he explained to Sarah as he made final adjustments to his frequency detector. "The shield generators cycle through different patterns every 30 seconds. For about 3 seconds in each cycle, they're vulnerable to projectiles fired at a specific energy frequency." Sarah didn't pretend to understand the science, but she trusted Tommy's intelligence. The young man had been studying technology obsessively since the invasion began, and he had already proven himself by keeping their heating systems running when any normal person would have given up. The bait for their trap was already in place. Doctor had used her knowledge of patrol patterns to predict where they could stage a fake distress signal that would draw a small squad of soldiers into the tunnels. The plan was simple. Make it look like a group of humans was trapped in a collapsed section of tunnel, lure the inn to investigate, then spring the ambush. But as Sarah crouched behind a pile of rubble, waiting for the enemy to arrive, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had been conquering planets for thousands of years. How could they be fooled by such a simple trick? "Contact," whispered through the radio. He was positioned at the tunnel entrance, watching for the patrol. 3 soldiers moving toward the bait location. They're on foot, no hover technology. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. If they were on foot, it meant they were taking the bait seriously. Their confidence was about to become their downfall. The 3 soldiers moved through the tunnel with the fluid grace typical of their species. Even in the dim emergency lighting, their pale blue skin seemed to glow with an inner light. They carried weapons that looked like works of art, smooth, curved devices that probably contained enough firepower to level a city block. But Sarah could see that they were being careless. They moved in a loose formation, not watching each other's backs properly. Their attention was focused on the supposed trapped humans ahead, not on potential threats from the sides or behind. "Wait for my signal," Sarah whispered into her radio. They approached the staged collapse site where Doctor was hidden, making weak calls for help. The lead said something in their musical language, then switched to accented English. "Humans, you will come out slowly. Resistance is useless. You will be relocated to productive work assignments." It was the same speech they always gave. They seemed to genuinely believe they were doing humans a favor by enslaving them. From their perspective, they were rescuing primitive creatures from their own inadequate civilization. Doctor played her part perfectly, emerging from the rubble with her hands up, looking defeated and exhausted. "Please," she said, "there are children trapped back there. They need medical help." They exchanged glances. Sarah could see their shields shimmering around them like heat waves. The energy barriers would stop any conventional weapon, deflecting bullets and absorbing explosions. But if Tommy's modifications worked. "Now," Sarah whispered. Tommy activated his frequency detector and began counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire. The modified weapons erupted in a coordinated volley. The bullets glowed with strange blue energy as they left the barrels, and for a moment Sarah was sure the plan had failed. The projectiles seemed to hit the shields and dissolve harmlessly. But then something incredible happened. The shields flickered and failed, and the bullets continued through to strike their targets. 2 of them went down immediately, their superior anatomy no match for high-velocity rounds. The third managed to raise his weapon and fire a shot that melted a section of tunnel wall before put him down with a second volley. For several seconds, nobody moved. The tunnel was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of melted stone. Then Doctor spoke in a voice filled with wonder. "It worked, Tommy, you magnificent genius, it actually worked." The team emerged from their hiding spots, hardly daring to believe what they had accomplished. For the first time since the invasion began, humans had won a direct confrontation with soldiers. But Sarah knew they had to move quickly. "Right, help me get these bodies hidden. Tommy, can you figure out how their weapons work? Doctors, start examining their equipment. We have maybe 10 minutes before someone notices this patrol is missing." As her team sprang into action, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had proven that they could be beaten. The aliens weren't invincible, they were just technologically advanced, and technology could be understood and eventually defeated. Tommy was already working on one of the weapons, using his makeshift scanner to analyze its energy patterns. "This is incredible," he muttered. "The power source is some kind of crystalline matrix, and look at this, the weapon is designed to respond to neural patterns. That's why they never need to reload or aim carefully." Professor Wright was examining the armor with the eye of someone who had studied warfare his entire career. "Lightweight but incredibly strong," he observed. "And these communication devices in their helmets if we could intercept their transmissions." Doctor was focused on what looked like a small handheld computer. "I think this is some kind of data pad, if I can access their files." Suddenly, the device in her hands began glowing and emitting musical sounds. The team froze as alien text scrolled across the screen, accompanied by what sounded like an urgent message in the language. "That's not good," said. The message repeated several times, then switched to English. "Emergency alert. Patrol Unit 7 has missed scheduled check-in. All units converge on Sector 47 for search and recovery operation." Sarah felt her heart sink. They had maybe 5 minutes before the tunnels would be crawling with soldiers. But as she looked at her team, she realized something important had changed. They were no longer acting like defeated refugees. They were standing, moving with purpose, looking like soldiers again. "We need to go," she said. "But this isn't over. We've proven they can be beaten." As they gathered their equipment and the precious technology they had captured, Tommy made a discovery that would change everything. "Sarah," he called out, his voice filled with excitement, "you need to see this." He was pointing at one of the fallen, whose armor had been damaged in the fight. Beneath the sophisticated exterior technology, Sarah could see something that made her gasp. The skin was artificial. Underneath the pale blue exterior was something that looked almost human, pale, yes, but clearly organic tissue that had been modified or enhanced somehow. "They're not aliens," Tommy whispered. "They're something else, something that was human once maybe, but changed." Doctor knelt beside the body and carefully examined the exposed tissue. "This looks like genetic modification on a massive scale, systematic alteration of human DNA to create a new species." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If there were modified humans, then the invasion wasn't just conquest. It was some kind of twisted family reunion. Somewhere in their past, these creatures had been like the people hiding in the tunnels. "We have to go," Professor Wright urged. "We can figure out what this means later." As they made their way through the dark tunnels, Sarah's mind was racing. Everything they thought they knew about the invasion was wrong. They weren't aliens from another star system. They were the descendants of humans who had somehow transformed themselves into something else entirely. But why had they come back to Earth? And what did they really want with the remaining natural humans? The questions would have to wait. Behind them, Sarah could hear the sound of search teams entering the tunnel system. The enemy's overconfidence was gone now. They knew the human resistance was more dangerous than they had thought. As Sarah led her people deeper into the underground maze beneath New York, she realized that everything had changed. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting to discover the truth about their own species and what humanity was meant to become. The real war was just beginning. Above them, the frozen city remained silent under its blanket of ice. But below ground, in the abandoned tunnels and forgotten spaces, something new was stirring. The humans weren't ready to become extinct, and they were no longer willing to go quietly into slavery. They had tasted victory, and they wanted more. The resistance cells around the world were about to discover that humanity's greatest enemy wasn't an alien species at all. It was what they themselves might become if they stopped fighting for their souls along with their freedom. And in the depths of the frozen earth, the next phase of human evolution was about to begin. The truth beneath the ice. The captured data pad revealed secrets that shattered everything Sarah's team thought they knew about the invasion. As Doctor worked through the night to decode the alien files, using Tommy's improvised translation software, the horrible truth began to emerge. They weren't conquerors from another planet, they were refugees. "Listen to this," Doctor said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and shock. She had been working for 16 hours straight, her eyes red from staring at the glowing screen. This is from what appears to be a historical record. Cycle 4847 since the Great Departure. The home world grows cold as the star dims. Food production has fallen by 37% this cycle. The Council authorizes increased harvesting from Seed World 1 to maintain population stability. Sarah leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the alien text that Tommy's software was slowly converting to English. Seed World 1. That's what they call Earth, Tommy said. He had been analyzing the technical specifications he'd found in the data pad's memory. But here's the really disturbing part. According to these files, Earth isn't their original home world. It's where they seeded the current human population. Professor Wright, who had been quietly listening from his corner of the tunnel, suddenly spoke up. That's impossible. Human evolution is well documented. We have fossil records going back millions of years. Doctor turned the data pad around so they could all see the display. Maybe not as impossible as we thought. Look at this genetic analysis chart. It shows the DNA patterns of what they call original humans compared to current seed population. The similarities are remarkable, but there are also systematic differences. The chart showed two genetic patterns that were clearly related, but had diverged significantly. The original humans showed modifications that enhanced physical strength, mental processing speed, and something labeled as neural collective interface compatibility. They didn't just evolve, Sarah realized. They changed themselves on purpose, but why? Tommy had found another file that made his face go pale. I think I know why. Look at this star chart. Their home world is in a system where the star is dying. They've been facing environmental collapse for thousands of years. The star chart showed a solar system with 12 planets, one of which was marked as the home world. According to the data, their sun had been gradually cooling forcing the population to make increasingly desperate adaptations. They modified themselves to survive in a colder environment, Doctor said, understanding dawning in her voice. Physical changes to handle low temperatures, mental modifications to work collectively instead of individually, enhanced technology to maintain their civilization as resources became scarce. But that doesn't explain why they came here, pointed out. If they adapted to survive in a cold environment, why do they need Earth? The answer came from a file that Tommy found buried deep in the data pad's memory. It was marked with symbols that the translation software couldn't interpret, but the contents were clear enough. Genetic degradation, Doctor read. Population sustainability crisis. Modified genome showing increasing instability after 3,000 cycles. Council authorizes return to Seed World 1 for genetic renewal and resource extraction. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. They had modified themselves so extensively that they were losing the ability to reproduce naturally. They needed fresh genetic material from unmodified humans to prevent their species from becoming extinct. That's why they're taking prisoners instead of just killing everyone, Sarah said. They need us alive. They need our genes. But there was something else in the files that made the situation even more complex. References to something called the Awakening Project and orders to identify humans with activation potential. What does activation potential mean? Asked. Tommy had found a technical manual that explained the term in chilling detail. According to this, some humans carry dormant genetic sequences that were planted by the ancestors before they left Earth. These sequences can be activated to begin the transformation process. You mean they can turn humans into? Sarah felt sick. Not exactly, Doctor said, studying the genetic data. It's more like they're trying to create a hybrid species, something that combines technological enhancement with human genetic stability. The implications were staggering. The invasion wasn't just about slavery or resource extraction. It was about creating a new species that could survive the death of the home world while preserving their advanced civilization. But as Sarah absorbed this information, she noticed something that gave her hope. The files also contained reports of failed experiments, resistance from human test subjects, and increasing concern among scientists about the viability of their project. Look at this, she said, pointing to a series of error reports. They're having trouble with the hybridization process. The human subjects keep rejecting the modifications. Tommy leaned over her shoulder to read the technical details. It says here that human consciousness is more resilient than they expected. The modification process works on a physical level, but the subjects retain human thought patterns and emotions. Many of them are refusing to cooperate with commands. This explained something that had been puzzling Sarah since the invasion began. They were clearly superior in terms of technology and organization, but their conquest of Earth had been surprisingly slow and inefficient. If they really were as advanced as they appeared, they should have been able to subjugate the planet in a matter of weeks. They're not conquerors, Sarah realized. They're desperate. Their home world is dying, their species is failing, and Earth is their last hope for survival. Professor Wright had been quietly studying a tactical map from the data pad. If that's true, then we might have more leverage than we thought. Desperate people make mistakes, and these reports suggest they're already making quite a few. The map showed the locations of installations around the world, including processing centers where captured humans were being held for genetic testing and modification attempts. But it also showed something else, areas marked as resistance zones, where operations had been unsuccessful. The other resistance groups said, they're not just surviving, they're actually preventing them from completing their mission. Sarah studied the map carefully. The resistance zones weren't randomly distributed. They were concentrated in areas with harsh natural environments, mountain ranges, desert regions, polar zones, places where humans had learned to survive in extreme conditions. Cold doesn't affect us the way it affects them, she realized. We evolved to handle environmental extremes. They modified themselves so much that they lost that adaptability. Tommy was excited now, his mind racing through the possibilities. If we can use Earth's environment against them, we might be able to turn their advantages into weaknesses. But before they could develop this idea further, the tunnel system shook with the sound of explosions from above. They had found their hideout. Emergency evacuation, Sarah ordered. Grab the essential supplies and the data pad, we need to move. As her team scrambled to gather their equipment, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of the war. Instead of running blindly through the tunnels, she was going to use what they had learned to strike back at the heart of the operation. Change of plans, she announced. We're not just running anymore, we're going to find the other resistance groups and share what we've learned. That's suicide, Professor Wright protested. They will be watching every communication channel. Not if we use their own technology against them, Tommy said, holding up a communication device he had taken from the dead soldier. I think I can modify this to send messages on frequencies they won't expect humans to be using. The sound of energy weapons echoed through the tunnels as search teams got closer. But Sarah no longer felt like a refugee running from superior force. She felt like a soldier with a mission. They had made a crucial mistake. They had assumed that humans would react to conquest the way other species had, with despair, submission, and eventual acceptance of their new status. But humans were different. They got angry. They got stubborn. And when they learned that their enemies were not invincible aliens but desperate refugees trying to steal their genetic heritage, they got furious. As Sarah led her team through the emergency escape routes, she was already planning their next move. The thought they were harvesting primitive creatures for their genetic renewal project. They were about to discover that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they had bargained for. The war for humanity's genetic future was about to begin, and this time, humans would be fighting with knowledge, purpose, and the rage of a species that refused to become extinct. The network awakens. Tommy's modified communication device worked better than anyone had dared to hope. Within hours of escaping their compromised hideout, Sarah's team had made contact with 17 different resistance groups across the globe. The revelation about the true nature spread through the underground network like wildfire. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the ice caves of Alaska came word that the survivors there had been conducting their own experiments on captured technology. They had discovered that the aliens' cold resistance was artificially maintained by their suits. Without the technology, they were actually more vulnerable to freezing temperatures than unmodified humans. The mountain fighters in the Himalayas reported that they had been tracking supply convoys and had noticed something interesting. The aliens seemed to have difficulty operating at high altitudes. Their ships became sluggish above certain elevations, and their soldiers required special breathing apparatus that humans didn't need. Most importantly, a group of scientists hiding in the abandoned research stations of Antarctica had been analyzing ice samples and had made a shocking discovery. The ice satellites weren't just freezing Earth. They were terraforming it to match the atmospheric conditions of the aliens' dying home world. Dr. Maria Santos, the lead researcher in Antarctica, explained the situation during a crackling radio transmission that Tommy's device barely managed to decode. The atmospheric composition in the frozen zones is changing. Increased nitrogen, decreased oxygen, trace amounts of gases that don't exist naturally on Earth. They're not just conquering our planet, they're trying to turn it into their home world. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air in their new hideout, an abandoned metro maintenance facility deep beneath the Hudson River. How long before the changes become irreversible? Based on our calculations, Dr. Santos replied, maybe 6 months. After that, the atmospheric modifications will be permanent. Earth will be habitable for but increasingly toxic for unmodified humans. The timeline changed everything. This wasn't just about resisting invasion anymore. It was about preventing the complete transformation of their planet into something that could no longer support human life. But the network of resistance groups had also uncovered something else. The location of the primary research facility where the hybridization experiments were taking place. Commander Jackson Hayes, a former Navy SEAL leading a resistance cell in the ruins of Washington, D.C., had managed to track several transport convoys to a massive installation beneath what used to be the Pentagon. "They've built something down there," he reported. "Our scouts describe it as a city-sized laboratory. That's where they're taking the captured humans for their experiments." Professor Wright, who had been studying tactical maps of the facility, looked grim. A direct assault on a target that size would require more resources than all the resistance groups combined could muster. But Tommy had been analyzing the technical specifications they had stolen from the data pad, and he had a different idea. "We don't need to assault it," he said. "We need to sabotage it. Look at this power distribution chart. The entire facility runs on a centralized fusion reactor that's connected to their atmospheric processing system." Doctor studied the schematics with growing excitement. If we could disrupt the reactor, it wouldn't just shut down the facility, it would reverse the terraforming process. The fusion reaction is contained by a magnetic field generated from 6 different points around the reactor core, Tommy continued. If even one of those field generators failed, the entire system would have to be shut down for safety reasons. Sarah began to see the outline of a plan. How many people would we need to reach those generators? Tommy consulted his calculations. Small teams, maybe 3 people each. The maintenance shafts are too narrow for soldiers, and the field generators are in sections of the facility where they wouldn't expect human infiltrators. Over the next several hours, the resistance network coordinated the most ambitious operation in the war so far. 6 teams would simultaneously infiltrate the underground research facility and disable the fusion reactor's magnetic containment system. Meanwhile, other resistance groups around the world would create diversions to draw forces away from the main target. Sarah would lead one of the infiltration teams, accompanied by Tommy, and the other teams were led by experienced fighters from resistance cells across the continent, each with their own technical expert and demolitions specialist. But as they prepared for the mission, Doctor made a discovery in the files that changed everything. "Sarah, you need to see this," she said, her voice filled with horror. "I found the real reason they chose Earth for their seeding project." She had uncovered historical records that went back thousands of years before the current invasion. The files described multiple visits to Earth by ancestors, not for conquest, but for refuge. "They've been using Earth as a genetic reservoir for their entire recorded history," Doctor explained. "Every few thousand years, when their population faces a crisis, they come back to harvest fresh human genetic material. This has happened at least 6 times before." The implications were staggering. Human civilization had risen and fallen repeatedly, with each collapse corresponding to a harvesting operation. The Dark Ages, the collapse of ancient empires, even prehistoric population bottlenecks that geneticists had never been able to explain. They were all the result of systematic exploitation by the aliens. "We're not just fighting for our freedom," Sarah realized. "We're fighting to break a cycle that's been going on for tens of thousands of years." But the files also revealed something else, something that gave her hope. The current expedition was different from previous harvesting operations. This time they weren't planning to leave. Their home world is finally dying, Doctor said. This isn't a temporary harvesting operation. This is their attempt at permanent colonization. They're putting all their remaining resources into transforming Earth because they have nowhere else to go. Tommy understood the implications immediately. That means this is their last shot. If we can defeat them here, we won't have to worry about them coming back in another few thousand years. As the teams prepared for the infiltration mission, Sarah found herself thinking about the cyclical nature of human history. How many times had her species climbed toward civilization only to be knocked down by creatures they didn't even know existed? How many potential achievements had been lost to alien intervention? But this time was different. This time, humans knew what they were fighting. They understood the stakes, and they had the technology and knowledge needed to fight back effectively. The infiltration began at dawn, with each team entering the underground facility through different maintenance access points. Sarah's team descended through an abandoned subway tunnel that connected to the installation's power distribution network. The facility was even more vast than their intelligence had suggested. Kilometers of corridors carved out of solid rock, laboratories filled with equipment that seemed to bend the laws of physics, and holding areas where thousands of humans were being kept for experimentation. But as they made their way toward the fusion reactor, Sarah began to notice something strange about the guards they encountered. Many of them moved awkwardly, as if they were still learning to use their bodies. Their responses to unexpected situations seemed slow and confused. "They're not all modified humans," Tommy whispered as they hid from a patrol. "Some of them are recent converts, humans who've been partially transformed but are still learning to function with their new abilities." The realization gave Sarah an idea. If some of the guards were recently converted humans, they might still retain some human loyalties and emotions. They might be allies rather than enemies. As her team approached the first magnetic field generator, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of the mission. Instead of avoiding the guards, she was going to try talking to them. The war for Earth was about to become a battle for the souls of humanity itself. And Sarah was betting everything on the hope that no amount of genetic modification could completely erase what made humans human. The fusion reactor hummed with power somewhere beneath them, holding together the entire operation. But Sarah knew that the real power lay in something the aliens had never been able to understand or control: the human capacity to choose hope over despair, freedom over security, and sacrifice over survival. The final phase of the war was about to begin. Rebirth. The converted human guard stared at Sarah through eyes that flickered between pale blue and natural brown. His name had been David Martinez before the transformation process began, and despite the physical modifications that had lengthened his limbs and paled his skin, Sarah could see traces of the person he had been. "I remember you," he said in a voice that carried both human emotion and alien harmonics. "You were on the news before the freezing, the captain who organized the evacuation of the Manhattan shelters." Sarah kept her weapon lowered but ready. Tommy flanked her, watching for other guards. They were deep in the facility now, just meters away from the first magnetic field generator that kept the fusion reactor stable. "I remember a lot of things," David continued. "My sister's laugh, the taste of pizza, the feeling of warm sunlight, but they're getting fainter every day. The neural modifications, they're designed to suppress human memories." "You can fight it," Sarah said urgently. "Other converted humans have broken free from the conditioning. We've seen it happen." David's expression showed a struggle that was both internal and alien. "The collective consciousness is so strong. It promises purpose, efficiency, survival for our species. Individual desires seem selfish in comparison." "Our species," stepped forward angrily. "They're not our species anymore, they're parasites." But Sarah held up a hand to stop him. She had realized something crucial about the conversion process from studying the files. The aliens weren't trying to erase human consciousness. They were trying to redirect it. The collective mentality that made society function required individual minds to voluntarily surrender their autonomy. "David," she said, using his human name deliberately, "do you remember why you became a police officer?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, his eyes flashed completely brown. To protect people who couldn't protect themselves. They told you that converting humans would save our species, didn't they? That the modifications would help us survive in their new world. David nodded, but his certainty was wavering. The mathematical models are clear. Unmodified humans cannot survive the atmospheric changes. Conversion is the only path to species preservation. What about choice? Tommy asked. What about letting humans decide for themselves? Individual choice leads to chaos, inefficiency, extinction. The response came automatically, but David's voice lacked conviction. Sarah pressed her advantage. You became a cop to protect people's right to make their own choices, even bad ones. They are taking that away. They're not saving humanity, they're erasing it. The internal struggle playing out on David's modified features was heartbreaking to watch. Sarah could see him fighting against conditioning that had been designed by thousands of years of psychological engineering. But humanity had something the aliens had never encountered before: the stubborn refusal to accept reasonable surrender. The reactor, David said suddenly. If you shut it down, the atmospheric processors will stop working, the ice will begin to melt, Earth will return to its original environmental parameters. And the converted humans? Sarah asked. Without the supporting infrastructure, the modifications will begin to fail within weeks. Some of us might survive the reversion process, but most— He paused, and for a moment his voice was purely human. Most of us will die. The weight of that revelation settled over the team. They weren't just fighting to save humanity, they were potentially condemning thousands of converted humans to death. But David made the choice for them. Do it, he said. Whatever we've become, it's not what we chose to be. Give the rest of humanity the chance to remain human. He led them to the magnetic field generator, a crystalline structure that hummed with barely contained energy. Tommy immediately began setting up his improvised explosives while kept watch for other guards. There's something else, David said as they worked. The other research facilities around the world, they're not just for conversion. They're processing centers for something called the Synthesis Project. Sarah felt her blood chill. What kind of synthesis? Complete integration of human and genetic patterns. Not conversion of existing humans, but the creation of an entirely new species that would replace both races. David's modified features showed genuine horror. The first generation is scheduled to be birthed next week. The timeline had just become even more critical. If the synthesis project succeeded, it wouldn't matter if they reversed the terraforming process. The new hybrid species would be designed to survive in any environment while possessing technology and collective consciousness. Where are the other facilities? Sarah asked urgently. David accessed the collective data network through his neural implants, his eyes glowing with alien light. Beijing, London, Cairo, Sydney. Each facility is designed to produce 10,000 synthesis entities per month. Tommy finished setting his charges and activated the timer. 2 minutes until detonation. We need to get out of here and contact the other teams. As they moved through the facility corridors, Sarah used the captured communication device to alert the resistance network. The mission had grown far beyond shutting down a single research installation. They needed coordinated strikes on all the synthesis facilities simultaneously. But they had finally realized what was happening. Emergency alarms echoed through the underground complex as alien security forces mobilized to stop the sabotage. This way, David said, leading them through maintenance passages that bypassed the main security checkpoints. There's an emergency exit that connects to the old metro tunnels. Behind them, the magnetic field generator exploded in a flash of brilliant light. The facility's lights flickered as the fusion reactor began emergency shutdown procedures. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the synthesis project. As they reached the surface, emerging into the frozen wasteland of what had once been Washington, D.C., Sarah's communication device crackled with reports from resistance groups around the world. The Beijing facility had been destroyed by a coordinated assault led by Chinese military survivors who had been hiding in the Forbidden City's underground tunnels. The London operation had succeeded with help from converted humans who had broken free from their conditioning. But the facilities in Cairo were still operational, and the Sydney team had gone silent. We need to reach those facilities, Sarah said, But even as she spoke, she knew it was impossible. They were on different continents with no way to travel the frozen distances in time. That's when David made an offer that changed everything. The collective network includes transportation protocols, he said. I can access ship systems and redirect their own vessels to carry strike teams to the remaining facilities. You'd be betraying your entire species, pointed out. David's smile was purely human. I'm saving my species, the real one. Using his neural implants, David hacked into the command network and sent false orders that redirected transport ships to pick up what the aliens thought were captured resistance fighters for processing. Instead, the ships collected armed strike teams that immediately took control of the vessels and flew them toward the remaining synthesis facilities. The battle for Sydney became a desperate race against time, as the hybrid birthing process had already begun. Sarah's team, transported in a hijacked ship piloted by David, arrived to find the facility in the middle of producing its first generation of synthesis entities. The creatures that emerged from the artificial wombs were beautiful and terrible, human in basic form, but with the pale, luminous quality of skin and eyes that held an alien intelligence. They moved with perfect coordination, as if they were all parts of a single organism. But when Sarah and her team destroyed the facility's power core, something unexpected happened. Instead of dying, the synthesis entities began to change again. Their alien features faded, their coordinated movement became individual, and their eyes became fully human. The process isn't irreversible, Doctor observed over the radio from her command post. Without the technological support systems, the genetic modifications default back to human baseline. As Sarah watched the synthesis entities become fully human, she realized that they had made a fundamental error. They had assumed that their advanced technology could overcome human genetic resilience, but human DNA had a built-in resistance to modification that they had never encountered in other species. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a cascade of system failures, as the resistance network destroyed installations around the world. Without the supporting infrastructure, the terraforming process reversed itself, the conversion procedures failed, and the synthesis entities reverted to purely human form. Many of the converted humans died during the reversion process, but thousands survived, including David, who became a crucial link between the recovering human civilization and the knowledge gained from technology. The ice began to melt 6 months after the fusion reactors were destroyed. As green shoots appeared through the thawing soil, Sarah stood in what had once been Central Park and watched the sunrise over a world that was becoming human again. They themselves had not been destroyed. Their dying home world still orbited its cooling star somewhere among the distant galaxies. But their last desperate attempt at colonization had failed, and their species would have to find another solution to their survival crisis. As for humanity, they had learned something crucial about their own nature. They were more resilient than they had known, more adaptable than their enemies had calculated, and more stubborn than any rational species had a right to be. The frozen Earth had been laughed at by the Star Empire as a source of primitive genetic material. But those frozen fighters had taught the universe an important lesson. Never underestimate a species that refuses to accept extinction, no matter how reasonable it might seem. Humanity had been reborn from ice and desperation, and they were ready for whatever challenges the galaxy might offer them next. The laughter had stopped. The real adventure was just beginning.